Greetings YouTube, this is Gaisowiros, and for today's video we will tackle the topic of Gaulish brewing, more specifically that of ale brewing. In French we have a word that is used in the context of ancient ale, more often Gaulish ale, cervoise. The etymology behind cervoise reveals the Gaulish root, curmi, which in turn also gave kuru in Welsh, but also another Gaulish word, cervesia, that entered Latin and is now alive in Romance languages as cervoise or cerveza. Cervesia might have been a more specific kind of ale, while curmi was the more general term. We know of an interesting Gaulish personal name, curmisagios, which means the one who seeks ale. And it is a name I almost decided to use before settling on Gaisowiros. The reason being that I am an enjoyer of fine malt brews. I have been working as a beer sommelier for some years now, and I also have experience brewing beer and mead. This gave me the idea to combine two of my interests with this video. Before we dive into the details, I would like to take the time to elaborate on the terminology that I will use in this video. First of all, there is a reason why I choose to talk of Gaulish ale and Gaulish beer. The word beer, at least in the beer sommelier culture that I know, is used to describe a malt brew where the hops are the main bittering agent. Thus, we do not see beer until the end of the Middle Ages. Hops were certainly used before that, but brewers also added other kinds of botanicals to make the ale bitter. Nowadays, a brew that contains a variety of bittering agents would be called a grute. These botanicals could vary a lot. The brewers most often simply used what was available near them, but some plants were more popular than others. Henbane was used for brewing, and we know today that it has toxic effects in high concentrations, but probably some slight psychoactive effects in smaller concentrations. We also see juniper berries and Miracle Gale being used quite often. You will thus expect a very different nose from these brews, since our sense of smell is quite used to hops, even in lighter beers like American lagers. Speaking of lagers, the other reason why I talk of Gaulish ale is because the term ale also refers to a category of yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which in Latin means sugar mushroom of Cervesia, the same species of yeast that ferments wine and bread. Ale ferments at high temperatures, from around room temperature to around 40 degrees Celsius for some famous yeasts like the Norwegian Kveik. Lager yeast, however, ferments at low temperatures, around 15 degrees Celsius. Why it could have been possible for an Iron Age brewer to let some wort ferment in a cold room, say in winter, and they got lucky and some lager yeasts found their way there to ferment lager, we do not have clear evidence that they brewed in cold temperatures like that. But there are other things that can ferment in warm temperatures. For yeast, they are the infamous Brettanomyces or simply Brett. While unwanted in wine, Brett yeast is found in some specific beer styles today, like lambic, some saison, and old ales. They are very resilient and can feed on sugars that are normally unfermentable, and this has the unfortunate reality that they can infect a beer and be hard to get rid of. The other reason why they are undesirable, especially in wine, is that they give off very distinctive flavors that are reminiscent of the smell of wood, cheese, barnyard, horse, and even band-aids for some. The other interesting thing about Bretts is that when they ferment in contact with oxygen, they create acetic acid. If that term sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you know that vinegar contains acetic acid. In fact, vinegar, coming from the French word vinaigre, literally means sour wine. Wine that has turned and got infected with Brett and then fermented in contact with oxygen would turn into sour wine. The alcohol can also be turned into more acetic acid with the help of bacteria called Acetobacter or Acetobacter if you want to use a classical pronunciation. That industry was popular to the Romans and perhaps even for the Gauls before the Roman conquest. Vinegar is traditionally made with vinegar mothers in a process that's almost the same as with our modern kombucha. The other microorganisms that can join the fermentation party are many, but bacteria is a popular one. Sour ales are often done with ketosouring, where lactobacilli eat the sugar from the sweet wort and let out carbon dioxide and lactic acid, which is what gives the beer its sourness. And by the way, lactobacilli bacteria are also what partly ferment sourdough bread and yogurt. Of course, nobody before the invention of the microscope knew of these microorganisms fermenting their brews, Gauls included. Before that, brewers only counted on their recipes, their tools, and their ingredients to help with the fermentation, with probably a good dose of superstition. This leaves a lot of room for a whole variety of different organisms to join the fermentation party, and not just Saccharomyces cerevisiae. There is a very high chance breads and bacteria were also fermenting the wort. These sugars wouldn't have come only from the malt, since again, brewers used what was available near them at the time of the brewing process. They could have put honey, grapes, or other fruits alongside the malt to add sugar, and even some good wild yeast which was already on the skins of these fruits. It goes the same way for the malt, the grain. Today the most popular malt for brewing is barley malt. Barley was indeed fairly popular for the Iron Age Celts, and we even have Greek sources speaking of barley wine, which points to a particular status that the grain would have enjoyed. However, it is very likely brewers mostly used what was available near them depending on the season. These grains would include wheat, oats, rye, buckwheat, but barley was king. We have found interesting evidence of how they would have made the malt. In Hochdorf in Germany, archaeologists have uncovered possible evidence of an Iron Age brewery of Celtic culture, at least evidence for the production of malt. Interestingly, the site is theorized as being nearby to the residence of a Celtic prince. Dr. Hans-Peter Sticka, the archaeologist who wrote the articles that I used as the main sources behind this video, proposes this scenario for how the malting at Hochdorf was done. They laid the grain in ditches where the ambient humidity would have made the grain sprout. Then, according to Dr. Sticka, the sprouted grain could have been laid on top of superstructures, made out of mud, bricks and wood, far out of contact with the humid soil, and fires would have been lit at the end of the ditches, so that the sprouted grains were dried. Today the roasting process is very precise, because we use electrical heating components that are controlled with thermometers. Back then, the heat of the flame would have been quite chaotic and hot, so the malt near the flame would have been very roasted and dark, and the malt further away would indeed have been paler, but nothing like the pale malt that we use today. Instead, it would have been what we call caramel malt, at least. This grain, being more roasted, would give a darker color to the ale, like a red ale today, with a lower sugar content though. But since the brewers didn't discard the black malt, they would add it to the brew too, making the final product much darker, like a hazy dark brown. What happens to the sugars then? Well, today we pitch yeast in the brew, so that we know what ferments the sugar. But the Gauls wouldn't have known about microbiology. Maybe they could have pitched the barm, which is the foam that floats on fermenting ale. But it could have been very likely that they only let nature do its thing, letting the yeast that's either in a fermenting vessel, a wooden barrel bars a lot of yeast by the way, or on the skins of the different fruit, or even from the air. Of course, this makes the process of fermenting much riskier, and I would expect brewers to be very superstitious about their methods. Concerning vessels, Dr. Sticka reminds us in his 1996 article that they were probably made out of wood, meaning they've decomposed over time, making archaeological finds of barrels of ale very unlikely. So what can we expect a Gaulish ale to look and taste like? First off, its color will be rather dark, like a light brown, because they couldn't control the malt roasting temperature as well as we do nowadays. then the nose would have been quite complex, for they use many different botanicals in their ales, and also because the ale was fermented by many different organisms. Then the first sip would reveal some acidity, as well as a very dry mouthfeel, but with possibly a thicker texture from the oats, wheat and even fruits in the ale. The nose would explode in complex botanical and funky flavors, but it will not feel very bitter on the tongue. It wouldn't feel like beer that we are used to, but that is what people drank in the Iron Age. They would be very impressed by our brewing standards and quality. For them, a clear, non-sour, light and bitter beer would be a masterwork feat, especially the fact that the beer can be reproduced in different contexts, with the privilege that we have to be able to import quality grain from vast distances. They would find that our breweries don't have enough varieties between them though. Where are all the local fruits and various grains unique to the region where it was brewed? Some things to keep in mind the next time you drink or make a malt brew. I hope this video was informative and that my expertise on the topic of ale was helpful. Thanks for watching, this is Gaisowiros, see you next time.